Thanks for joining us today on today's podcast episode where we're picking up part 2 of the link between hormone decline and depression. Last week, just briefly, we discussed the 3 challenges that have to be overcome in order to enter into this conversation. The first one was confirmational bias, or overcoming the things that you've been taught since the very beginning. Challenge number 2 was reductionist treatment, or the disease model versus the complexity of the human system model. And challenge number 3 was adaptation. So join us as we pick back up where we left off last week with this podcast episode already in progress. Here at the Optimal CEO Podcast, we help CEO entrepreneurs who love taking ownership of their wellness journey because they know it's their most prized investment. And when their state of wellness is at its peak, their income soars. We want to help relieve CEO entrepreneurs from the pressure of unnecessary health exposure so they can be highly focused on growing their business and physically optimized for the journey so they can enjoy getting there. The Greeks understood the exposome, the human exposome, when they didn't even have a word for it. Thousands of years ago, they viewed health as a state of dynamic equilibrium between the internal and the external environment. They believed that illness resulted when this balance was upset. Hippocrates said that the internal equilibrium depended on the external equilibrium between a person and his or her environment. And Hippocratic medicine, which ironically is where modern day allopathic medicine came out of, and we've so far gone off that path. Hippocratic medicine has deemed patient-centered rather than disease-oriented medicine as the treatment of choice. Again, how have we gotten so far away from that? We've gotten away from patient-centered medicine, and we're so disease-oriented. It goes back to that reductionist view. And how do we get down this reductionist path? That's a conversation for a different day. But a little hint, it has to do with economic agendas related to big Fortune 500 companies. Anyway, sidebar. So what are some of the areas of exposure that make up the human exposome? Let me read off a list of a few of those. So if we're only looking at, say, the human exposome and depression, then we have to look at mindset. We have to look at stress. We have to look at community. We have to look at work and relationships and activity, meaning physical activity. We look at the microbiome, and the microbiome is simply your gut health. When I went through my training 20 plus years ago, over 20 years ago, it was 25 years ago, they told us that all of your serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, all your feel-good chemicals that alleviate depression are produced in this nice little vault called your brain, your cranium, and nowhere else. And then when they started doing genetic research and they switched over to the human exposome and started doing microbiome research, the Human Microbiome Project, where they're trying to map out the gut flora, the gut bacteria, the good and the bad. And actually the word bad is being thrown out of the vocabulary because they're learning that they're all good. They just work in a symbiotic relationship. That most all of your serotonin is actually produced in your gut. Now that's mind-blowing for people in the mental health field who were trained 20 plus years ago, because we were taught that it was all produced in your brain. And in actuality, it's not, it's your gut. So that's a little sidebar there. Going on down the list of aspects of the human exposome as related to depression, you've got to also look at nutrition, you've got to look at hormones, and you have to look at epigenetics. Now, I'm going to explain more about epigenetics here in just a minute because it's a little bit different than just pure genetics or gene snip type of thinking. But those are the things that we look at. And if you could imagine in the center, draw a circle in the center of your page and write exposome in it, and then put all of these little bubbles with all these little different things: mindset, community, stress, relationships, work, activity, microbiome, nutrition, epigenetics, hormone, all around it in all these little bubbles. And then draw lines, relationship lines between each and every one of them, and link them all together, and link them to the center bubble as well. That's the complex web that actually makes up us human beings. And also, again, when I was trained for years, we've been taught the biopsychosocial model, and we're told that there were three aspects to human behavior and human disease process. It's the biological, the psychological, and the social. And it's so much more complex than even that. It was on the right path. It was moving in the right direction. But it's so much more than that. It's actually exposomal, not biopsychosocial. But again, these are terms that you don't really need to know. You just need to understand concepts. So let's talk a little bit more about epigenetics. Epigenetics are actually cool. So before we get deep into the aspects of, or deeper into the aspects of hormone decline, I want to talk to you about epigenetics. And I know I'm throwing a lot of terms at you: exposome, epigenetics, microbiome, reductionist. I don't normally do that, but it's really important here to think of epigenetics as a dimmer switch. Okay. In its most simplistic form, that's the way you need to view it. It's a dimmer switch for your genes. Now, things can actually come along and dial that dimmer switch up, or things can come along and dial that dimmer switch down. For example, mindset, it can dial that dimmer switch up or down. Stress, up or down. Community can dial it up or down. Relationships, up or down. Activity, physical activity, can dial it up or down. In fact, what I just ran across recently is that physical activity on a regular basis actually positively affects 5,000 genes in the human body. That's tremendous because they'll dial up the ones that need to be dialed up and dial down the ones that need to be dialed down. So I think you get the idea. Epigenetics is like dimmer switches for your genes, and positively you can dial up a negative, or dial down a negative gene, or dial up a good gene, both of which are good. But epigenetics works both ways. You can also dial down a good gene or dial up a bad gene. What are some of the things that can cause this dialing up? Well, hormones can do this. Let me explain here. Contrary to popular belief, vitamin D is not a vitamin. It's actually a hormone. So in research studies, low vitamin D has been linked to cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, and cancer. Now, we cannot, I repeat, we cannot say that vitamin D treats these. That would be careless. The research has to be done in these areas in order to prove that vitamin D can actually treat these. However, here's what we do know as we're beginning to understand the impact of the benefits of vitamin D. In a recent study of low-dose vitamin D, and that's only 400 international units per day, or 400 IUs per day. Researchers measured the epigenetic impact of vitamin D on the human body. They measured 291 different genes and found that 82 inflammatory provoking genes were downregulated or dialed down, and 209 health promoting genes were upregulated or dialed up, which have ties to mood, anxiety, attention, memory, and metabolism, just to name a few. Now let's take a look at how meditation affects mood hormones. Now, I know meditation is not a hormone, but it does affect mood and hormones, and I'll prove it to you. So this is why I threw this in here, because it's hugely important to understand epigenetics and this dialing up and this dialing down. It should be noted that some of the genes affected by meditation are also positively involved in hormone expression. The study that I'm going to talk to you about didn't specifically talk about the hormone aspect, but when you cross-reference the genes that were positively affected, they have hormone-enhancing benefits. So when you look at the epigenetics of meditation on mood and stress response, and actually hormone response, in a recent study found that 2,209 genes were positively expressed between long-term meditators and the control group. That just means the placebo group, those that didn't do meditation. 1,275 of those were upregulated or dialed up, and 934 were positively dialed down or downregulated, meaning bad genes were turned off. So 934 bad genes were turned off, 1,275 good genes were turned up. It also found that short-term meditators who committed only 8 weeks to practicing meditation had 1,561 genes that were positively expressed. Again, 874 positive genes were dialed up and 687 negative genes were dialed down. Now let's take a deeper look at hormone depletion, the symptoms of menopause and andropause, and the similarities to depression. You guys can't see this, but I have in front of me a graph. On the left-hand side is the percentage of hormone production or output. It ranges from 20% to 100%. On the bottom, or the x-axis, if you want to remember back to your algebra and geometry, the bottom line is actually age, ranging from 0 to 80 plus. For men, testosterone peaks in their 20s. For women, estrogen peaks in their 30s. After these peaks, we start to see significant declines each year. Remember, we said 1 to 2% decline per year once that decline starts. If you could place this graph over the graphs for depression that we talked about earlier among women and over the suicide graph that we talked about for men, there would be significant relationships in that the loss of hormones would correlate with the increase in depression and increase in suicide. So just the takeaway from this is that hormone peaks for men in their 20s, it peaks for women in their 30s, and starts drastically declining after that, and that decline actually correlates on those other slides with depression and suicidal behavior. So when you look at the symptoms of menopause and andropause, they have many similarities among men and women. For example, men and women both will struggle with forgetfulness. Oddly enough, they'll struggle with hot flashes and night sweats. They'll actually struggle with joint aches and pains, mood swings, depression, which is what we're talking about here today, headaches, insomnia, weight gain, bone loss, decreased motivation, lack of focus, lack of energy, and muscle loss. Those are the symptoms of menopause and andropause that men and women share, and depression and mood swings is right up there in the top. So, not ironically, there are also crossover symptoms with hormone decline and a formal diagnosis of depression. So there appears to be a correlation between hormone decline, age, mood decline, and depressive symptoms. But is the hormone decline the only modifiable factor? Well, I don't know. Let's look at the symptoms of low testosterone. Depression, anxiety, irritability, edginess, lethargy or fatigue, insomnia, difficulty sleeping, weakness, aches and pains, weight gain, decreased libido, decreased sex drive, cognitive decline or memory decline, fuzzy thinking or brain fog, decreased motivation, previous leisure activities are not enjoyable anymore, and general loss of interest. If you look at the symptoms for depression, feeling anxious or on edge, remember that was a symptom of low testosterone. Feeling sad or depressed, again, a symptom of low testosterone. Being irritable, again, a symptom of low testosterone. And we're talking about these depression symptoms here. Feeling tired or lethargic or fatigued, again, both depression and testosterone. Aches and pains, overeating and weight gain, problems with sexual desire and performance, cognitive decline, decreased motivation, loss of interest in work, family, or once pleasurable activities. There's this huge crossover between depression and low testosterone as we age. Just like some gurus stand up and say, my snake oil is the only remedy for what ails you, saying that replenishing hormones is the only answer would be careless. So in answer to the question, is hormone decline the only modifiable factor? I have to give a resounding no. It would be very careless of me to do that, especially after talking to you about the human exposome and how complex the human body is. In my personal clinical experience and in the literature, hormones have a huge positive impact. So let's take a look at what the literature said, the medical research says, and we'll look at testosterone first. When you look at 7 of the largest double-blind placebo-controlled studies for testosterone, testosterone significantly improved depression when compared to placebo. Now, what is a double-blind placebo-controlled study? A double-blind placebo-controlled study means the researchers didn't know what the people were getting and until after the study, and the participants in the study didn't know what they were getting until after the study. Placebo-controlled means that 50% of the group got testosterone, 50% of the group got no testosterone, but they were still taking it in the same form. So if it was a cream-based, they were getting a cream-based placebo with no testosterone in it. It was just cream, and they were rubbing it on their skin, or gel the same way, or an injection the same way. So that's what a double-blind placebo-controlled study is. It's actually the best study there is. And when you look at the totality of research from the 1970s until today, there have been just around 70 some odd studies. 7 of them were set up perfectly as double-blind placebo-controlled studies, and those are the ones that we actually wanted to look at. So this particular study brings that out. It's called a meta-analysis, but you don't need to know that word either. It just means they looked at a bunch of studies at one time. In fact, when you take a deep dive into the data, testosterone was 4 times more effective than placebo in treating depression. That's huge and definitely nothing to sneeze at. In fact, for those science gurus out there, there were 355 total people included in this. The duration of treatment was 6 to 12 weeks, which is pretty much the standard duration of treatment for an antidepressant trial, 6 to 12 weeks. And the testosterone beat the placebo group 4 times. It was 4 times more effective. That is so huge, I can't even begin to explain. And just in case you're wondering what measurement tool they use a standard research measurement tool that we actually use in clinical office called the Hamilton Depression Scale. So we use those in research, we use those in clinical settings like our offices as well. And it's a standard tool for measuring depression. So it wasn't like they made up their own tool or something like that. It was hokey. No, these were Hamilton Depression Scales, 355 people, 6 to 12 week trials. And man, the results were just astounding. So that's testosterone. You draw your own conclusions on that. Does testosterone treat depression? I'll let you decide. So now let's take a look at hormone replacement therapy and effect on depression among women. Now, there are actually more studies done with women than there were with men, but they took a look at estrogen plus progestin, which is a synthetic progesterone, which I don't use for many, many reasons, and I'll discuss that here in just a second. Estrogen plus testosterone and testosterone by itself. So they looked at these studies for these factors. And so the evidence is irrefutable when it comes to women. 26 studies prove that hormone replacement therapy works for treating depression. Let me explain. When you look at the pooled data or the meta-analysis data in these 26 studies related to women and depression and hormones, estrogen outperformed placebo 69.4% better. Estrogen and progesterone was only 45.4% better than placebo. Estrogen plus testosterone outperformed placebo, get this, 89.6% better than placebo. And get this, this is even bigger. Testosterone outperformed placebo in women when treating depression, 136.7% better than placebo. These are huge statistics. Why did the progesterone plus estrogen group, or why was it the lowest? Because it was progestin. It was a synthetic progesterone. Progestin is notorious for causing irritability and depression, whereas micronized progesterone, which is a bioidentical plant-based progesterone, which has been widely studied since this study came out, actually treat depression. So I would love to see that data. I didn't have it when I was putting this together, but still 45.4% is better than a sugar pill, and that's what we're looking at. But when you look at the estrogen group at 69.4% better than placebo, the estrogen plus testosterone at 89.6% better, and the testosterone alone, which was 136.7% better. I mean, you do the math. I mean, I think it's fairly easy to draw conclusions on there. So why does this information appear to be withheld from medical providers? Because I can guarantee you, if you go to your OBGYN, if you go to your internist, if you go to your family practice doctor, and you start talking to them about hormones for treating depression versus an antidepressant, their eyes are going to glaze over and they're going to come up with 1,000 arguments why you shouldn't be using hormones. So why does this happen? Well, I have some hunches. As I'm discussing in my upcoming book, Happiness Hijackers, I do feel like Big Pharma doesn't want this information out there. Let's face it. It's way more lucrative to push the latest and greatest magic bullet treatment for depression, and it's certainly easier to flood the medical journals with articles that support that latest and greatest cash cow or magic bullet. And as you guys know that have been following me, and when you read my book, you'll certainly learn, I don't say this as an outsider. I say this as an insider. I practiced traditional psychiatry for a long time. Before about 8 years ago, I switched over and started doing functional and performance-based medicine. And what you guys don't know about me that you're about to learn is that 40% of my income, annual income for years, and I'm talking about 7, 8, 9 years, was gleaned from speaking for pharmaceutical companies. I know how that machine works. I know where the skeletons are in the closet, and I know how deep that rabbit hole goes. And I probably only know a scratching on the surface of that knowledge. So the bottom line is they have an agenda, a bottom line to protect, and I think that's why this information doesn't get out there. Now, hopefully in this podcast episode today, I've given you the evidence. The research shows that HRT helps with depression, but that's my interpretation of the research. You need to make your own conclusions. We know that depression and suicide rises with age, just as natural hormone decline occurs as we age. We know that hormones like vitamin D actually have positive effects on the genes that help with metabolism, mood, and inflammation. We also know that certain activities like meditation can also positively affect the genes associated with mood and stress responses. For me to sit here and say that I 100% believe that hormone replacement is the only answer would be very misleading. I believe that it's the total picture, the exposomal picture, the epigenetic picture that comes into play. However, I also believe that HRT or hormone replacement therapy is a great first place to start. especially for those who are age appropriate, having symptoms and or have lab work that shows there's an issue. But I don't want you to follow my lead. I want you to decide for yourself. Is age-related hormone decline a modifiable risk factor for depressive symptoms? I'll let you decide. Thanks for joining me today on today's podcast episode. I hope it's been informative, and my hat's off to your health journey, because we're all on this journey together. Thanks. You guys have a great day. I'd like to personally thank you for listening to this episode of the Optimal CEO podcast. I hope you found today's podcast informative and helpful on your personal optimization journey. You see, we love our Optimal CEO entrepreneurs, and thanks to people like you, the Optimal CEO community is growing. You can help us with that continued growth by giving us a like, sharing this podcast with your friends, or subscribing to our podcast feed. This is Dr. Brian Brown. Here's to you being the most physically optimized CEO entrepreneur possible, so you can have an even bigger impact on the world through your business. See you next time, and thanks again for listening.